A sultan walked out of his own palace, through a side door in the rain. He carried the same title his ancestors had held for 6 centuries. He boarded a foreign warship that would carry him past his own coastline for the last time. Each of these men had a January where servants still bowed, and a December where a hotel clerk asked for a passport. One lost a 600-year dynasty, one lost a 300-year one. One was 9 years old and did not understand why the exile train did not stop. 10 crowns, 10 single years, 10 calendars that outlived their kings. Number 10 begins with a country that lasted almost as long as a bad marriage. On the 10th of December, 1963, the Union Jack was lowered over Zanzibar. Prince Philip stood at attention. A young Arab sultan named Jamshid bin Abdullah signed papers that made him the head of a sovereign state inside the Commonwealth. New stamps with his profile, a new flag, a seat at the diplomatic table. 32 days later, he was on a boat, going the other way. His dynasty traced itself back to Oman, to Said bin Sultan, who had once moved his capital from Muscat to this island because the cloves were worth more than the desert. For 120 years, Arab sultans had ruled Zanzibar, but the palace had one problem no ceremony could hide. Zanzibar had roughly 230,000 Africans and around 50,000 Arabs, and the Arabs owned most of the land and most of the government jobs. The July 1963 election had given the African-led Afro-Shirazi Party 54% of the vote and only 13 seats. Britain handed independence to a monarchy that had already lost the mathematics of consent. Around 3 in the morning on the 12th of January, 1964, 600 to 800 insurgents led by a Ugandan drifter named John Okello attacked the Ziwani police barracks with spears, machetes, and surprise. By breakfast, they had the armory, the radio station, and the capital. Jamshid appealed to Kenya and Tanganyika for help. There was no help. There was only a boat. He asked to go to Oman. Oman refused. On the 21st of January, 1964, photographers waited outside the St. James's Hotel in London and captured the last Sultan of Zanzibar, arriving in a dark suit. He was 34. He was already a private citizen of a country that no longer existed. The revolution that followed was violent. Estimates of the death toll range from thousands to tens of thousands. 3 months later, Zanzibar merged with Tanganyika to form Tanzania. He lived quietly in Portsmouth for 50 years, denied resettlement in Oman by Sultan Qaboos until 2020, when Sultan Haitham finally let him come home. He died there on the 30th of December, 2024, at 95. The strange surviving trace is a postage stamp with his face on it. The country the stamp honors lasted longer as postage than it did as a state. A sultanate that lasted 32 days is a shock, but at least Jamshid got a full country to lose. The next king lost his to his own 6-month-old son. Number 9 is a fat king in a white uniform. In January 1952, Farouk I was still on the throne of Egypt. Ras El Tin Palace in Alexandria. A gold car for every day of the week. A newborn son named Ahmad Fuad. Farouk had inherited the throne at 16. He was handsome, then heavy, then a punchline in the international press. By July, he was a passenger. Egypt had been humiliated in the 1948 war with Israel. Weapons scandals exposed corruption. British soldiers were still in the Canal Zone. Inside the officer corps, the Free Officers Movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser and Mohammed Naguib, had been preparing for years. On the night of the 22nd of July, 1952, they moved. Tanks in Cairo, army headquarters captured. By dawn, the coup was almost complete. Farouk asked the Americans and the British to save his throne. Nobody moved. On the 26th of July, he signed the abdication in favor of his 6-month-old son, now Fuad II, king of Egypt. Egypt technically had a king for the next 11 months. That king was learning to sit up. The royal yacht, Marusa, carried Farouk to Naples. Fuad II was sent to Switzerland with his mother. On the 18th of June, 1953, the free officers abolished the monarchy. The infant king was deposed by decree at 1.5 years old. Farouk drifted through Rome and Monte Carlo, grew heavier, collected antiques and girlfriends, and died at a Rome restaurant table in 1965 of a heart attack. He was 45. The strange surviving trace is the Mahrusa itself, launched in 1865, still afloat, now the presidential yacht of the Republic of Egypt. The same vessel that carried the last king out of Alexandria is now the boat of the state that replaced him. He was the last man to sit on the throne of Egypt as an adult. His son inherited it as a rumor. Farouk sailed east into a Roman cafe. The next king sailed west into a suburban house in London and became a scholar of the crown he no longer wore. Number 8 begins with 2 bullets. On the 1st of February, 1908, in an open carriage in Lisbon, an assassin shot King Carlos I and Crown Prince Luis Felipe dead. The second son, an 18-year-old named Manuel, was wounded in the arm. By the time the carriage reached the palace, he was, without warning, the King of Portugal. He would hold the title for 2 years, 8 months, and 4 days. The Braganza dynasty stretched back to 1640. Portugal still ruled Angola, Mozambique, and Macau. But the aura of the monarchy died in that carriage. The Republican movement had been growing since the 1890s. The state was bankrupt. On the 3rd of October, 1910, sailors mutinied in Lisbon Harbor. On the 5th of October, less than 48 hours later, a republic was proclaimed from the balcony of City Hall. Manuel fled north with his mother to Ericeira, where the royal yacht Amelia waited. He sailed to Gibraltar, then England. He was 20 years old, and he had lost the country in 3 days. He settled at Fulwell Park in Twickenham, West London, a comfortable, unremarkable suburban house. He did not campaign for restoration. He read. He collected. Over 20 years he built one of the great private libraries of early Portuguese literature and published serious scholarship on medieval Portuguese kings. He died at Fulwell Park in July 1932, at 42. The republic that had expelled him accepted his body. Portuguese warships carried him home for a state funeral at the Pantheon of the Braganzas. The strange surviving trace is a library. Thousands of rare Portuguese books, catalogued in exile, went to the Palace of Vila Viçosa. The last king of Portugal became one of the most useful sources for anyone studying the first kings of Portugal. The country that would not have him alive gave him a hero's funeral dead. Manuel lost a throne. The next 3 men lost the empires the thrones were sitting on top of in the same year. Number 7 is a man in an ornate uniform who spent the last 22 years of his life chopping firewood in a Dutch village. In January 1918, Wilhelm II was German Emperor, King of Prussia, Supreme Warlord, grandson of Queen Victoria, first cousin of Nicholas II of Russia and George V of Britain. When those 3 men met in photographs, their faces were almost interchangeable. By November, one of them was on a train to the Dutch border with no country behind him. Nearly 2 million German soldiers were dead. In autumn 1918, sailors at Kiel mutinied. Workers' councils sprang up in Munich, Bremen, and Hamburg. On the 9th of November, 1918, his chancellor announced his abdication in Berlin before Wilhelm had signed anything. Ludendorff and Hindenburg told him the army would not fight to bring him home. He left the same night by train into the neutral Netherlands. He signed a formal abdication on the 28th of November. The empire was already gone. Queen Wilhelmina refused Allied demands to extradite him. He bought a small estate called Huis Doorn and moved in 1920. He was 59, and he was going to live there for the rest of his life. He spent 21 years chopping wood. Every morning, the former German emperor put on gloves and went into the forest with an axe. He wrote memoirs blaming Jews, socialists, and his own generals. He hoped briefly that the Nazis would restore the monarchy. They did not. He died in June 1941 as German troops occupied the country, sheltering him. He left instructions that his body was not to return to Germany until the monarchy was restored. It never was. He is still buried at Huis Doorn. The strange surviving trace is a museum. Huis Doorn is open to visitors today. His desk, his cigarette case, the uniforms he wore when he was Supreme Warlord, all displayed by the state that once served him. Wilhelm's Germany replaced him with a republic. The next emperor was replaced by nothing at all. His country simply stopped existing around him. Number 6 is Karl I. Habsburg, Emperor of Austria, Apostolic King of Hungary. When he came to the throne in November 1916, he inherited an empire of 50 million people, 12 official languages, and a family that had ruled parts of Central Europe for more than 6 centuries. Schönbrunn Palace, the Hofburg, the double-headed eagle on every gate. He was 29. He would be emperor for 2 years and 11 days. The Habsburg Empire was not a country. It was a dynasty holding down a dozen nations. On the 28th of October, 1918, Czechoslovakia declared independence. On the 29th, the South Slavs. On the 31st, Hungary. Within 72 hours, the empire lost most of its population. Karl was still formally the emperor, but there was no empire left. On the 11th of November, 1918, he signed a carefully worded document at Schönbrunn, renouncing any participation in the administration of the state. He did not abdicate. His lawyers had picked the wording. He wanted to preserve his family's claim. The next day, the Austrian Republic was proclaimed. The Habsburgs were banned from the country by law unless they renounced all claims. Karl refused. He went into exile in Switzerland with his wife Zita. He tried twice, in 1921, to reclaim the throne of Hungary. Both attempts failed. The Allies deported him to Madeira. On the 1st of April, 1922, he died of pneumonia in a rented house on the island, aged 34. Empress Zita wore black for the rest of her life. She died in 1989 at 96, still describing her son Otto as the rightful emperor. The strange surviving trace is a Vatican ruling. In October 2004, Pope John Paul II beatified Karl I of Austria, a blessed emperor of a nation no map shows. Karl was 31 when his empire dissolved. The next tsar was 9. Number 5 is a small boy in a large room. On the 28th of August, 1943, King Boris III of Bulgaria died suddenly. The cause is still disputed. Some sources say heart attack. Others say poisoning, possibly on Hitler's orders after Boris refused to deport Bulgarian Jews and refused to send troops to the Eastern Front. The Bulgarian royal house has never picked between the two versions. What is not disputed is what came next. His 6-year-old son, Simeon, was proclaimed Tsar Simeon II. A regency council was created. Bulgaria was on the losing side of the war. On the 5th of September, 1944, Stalin declared war on Bulgaria. 3 days later, the Red Army entered without resistance. On the 9th of September, a communist-backed coup deposed the regents. The Tsar's uncle and more than 100 officials were tried by a people's court and executed in February 1945. The 7-year-old king was not touched. He was too small to be a threat. On the 15th of September, 1946, with Soviet troops present, Bulgaria voted on the abolition of the monarchy. The official result was 95.6% for a republic. The vote was almost certainly not free. It did not need to be. On the 16th of September, 1 day later, the royal family was placed on an exile train. Simeon was 9 years old. He never abdicated. Nobody asked him to. Bulgaria simply told him to leave. The train carried them to Alexandria in Egypt, where his grandfather, Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, was already living in exile. Alexandria in 1946 was a strange court of dethroned kings. In 1951, the family moved to Madrid. On his 18th birthday, in accordance with the old Tarnovo constitution, Simeon declared himself Tsar of all Bulgarians. The Bulgarian people, behind the Iron Curtain, did not hear it. 50 years passed. Communism collapsed. In 1996, he visited Sofia for the first time since he had been a child. In 1998, the Bulgarian Constitutional Court ruled that Vrana Palace, the same building where his father had died and where the exile train had collected the family, must be returned to him. In 2001, he founded a political party, won the parliamentary election, and on the 24th of July was sworn in as Prime Minister of the Republic of Bulgaria, taking an oath to the Republican Constitution while still, in his private language, holding a claim to the throne. He is the only person in modern history to lose a throne as a small boy and return half a century later to govern the same country from the other side of the constitution. So far, revolutions and referendums. The next two thrones fell to something quieter. A signature. Number 4 is a rainstorm, a side door, and a British warship. On the 1st of November, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. 6 centuries of Osman ended in a single sitting. No army, no mob, just a piece of paper voted through by a parliament that had until recently not even been recognized as a government. The last sultan, Mehmed VI Vahideddin, was the 36th Padishah in a dynasty stretching back to the late 13th century, 641 years. He had been crowned in July 1918 with the sword of Osman. 4 months later, the Ottoman Empire had lost the First World War. By 1922, he was living in Dolmabahçe Palace. British and French warships were anchored offshore. The Treaty of Sèvres had dismembered the empire. Meanwhile, Mustafa Kemal had built a parallel government in Ankara. The palace still looked the same. The country underneath it did not. On the 16th of November, Mehmed sent a private letter to the British commander in Constantinople asking for asylum. On the 17th of November, 1922, at dawn, in a heavy rain, he walked out of a side gate of his own palace with a small suitcase, a handful of servants, and his son. He boarded the British battleship HMS Malaya. As the historian Alan Palmer later wrote, he could not make a dignified departure worthy of the heir to 6 centuries of sovereignty. He literally snuck out. He sailed to Malta, then to San Remo. His cousin, Abdulmecid II, was elected caliph 2 days after Mehmed left. Abdulmecid held the title for 16 months. In March 1924, that too was abolished. A ban on all members of the dynasty setting foot in Turkey was passed the following month. Mehmed died in San Remo on the 16th of May, 1926. He was 65. As Turkish and Italian sources later reported, his coffin was detained by local creditors over unpaid debts. Eventually, the debts were settled, and his body was transported to Damascus and buried at the Sultan Selim I Mosque. He was the first Ottoman sultan since the fall of Constantinople in 1453 not buried in that city. The strange surviving trace is a sword. The sword of Osman, with which every Ottoman sultan was girded for 6 centuries, remains in Topkapı Palace Museum. The state that abolished him kept the object that made him. No army broke the gates of Dolmabahçe. A single vote in Ankara ended 6 centuries. Paperwork did the work armies could not. The Ottomans fell to their own parliament. Iran's founding Shah fell to 2 parliaments that were not even Iranian. Number 3 is a self-made king betrayed by geography. Reza Shah Pahlavi had not been born a royal. He rose through the Persian Cossack Brigade, took part in a 1921 coup, and in 1925, the Iranian parliament elected him the new Shah. He founded the Pahlavi dynasty. He changed the name of the country from Persia to Iran. He built the Trans-Iranian Railway. By January 1941, he was 62 and ruled Iran with absolute personal authority. The hidden weakness was not domestic. It was the map. Iran was sandwiched between British oil interests in the south and the Soviet Union to the north. Reza Shah had allowed a substantial German technical presence in the country. In 1941, with Hitler driving into the Soviet Union, London and Moscow decided this was intolerable. They needed Iran as a supply corridor. On the 25th of August, 1941, British and Soviet forces launched a joint invasion. The Iranian army collapsed in days. Reza Shah asked what the Allies wanted. The answer was blunt. They wanted him gone. On the 16th of September, 1941, he signed his abdication in favor of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza. He was driven south to Bandar Abbas and placed aboard a British ship to Mauritius, an isolated Indian Ocean colony where he could not organize or embarrass the Allies. From there, he was moved to Johannesburg under British supervision. He died there in July 1944 at 66. His body was embalmed and shipped to Egypt, placed in a temporary tomb at the Al-Rifai Mosque in Cairo. Remember that mosque. 2 Iranian Shahs will pass through it. Only one of them will pass through it once. The strange surviving trace is the railway. The Trans-Iranian Railway that Reza Shah built as a monument to Iranian sovereignty became, in 1941, the corridor through which British and American supplies were shipped to Stalin's armies fighting Hitler. His engineering saved the invaders who deposed him. His son inherited the throne, the palace, and the same enemies. 38 years later, exactly the same door closed. Reza Shah lost his throne to 2 foreign armies. This next emperor lost his to his own soldiers and to his own cousin. Number 2 is a family portrait and a railway carriage. In January 1917, Nicholas II was emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. 304 years of Romanov rule behind him. 175 million subjects. Winter Palace, Alexander Palace, Peterhof. By December, he was a prisoner in his own house, and the dynasty was gone. Russia had lost, by conservative estimate, 1.7 million soldiers in the First World War. Bread prices had multiplied. Rasputin had been murdered in December 1916 by aristocrats, including one of the Tsar's own relatives. The bullet did not save the monarchy. It confirmed how far the palace had drifted. On the 8th of March, 1917, women in Petrograd marched for bread. Workers joined them. Soldiers sent to disperse the crowds joined too. Within a week, the capital belonged to the revolution. The Duma and the generals told the Tsar the same thing. It was over. On the 15th of March, 1917, his imperial train was diverted to a railway siding at Pskov. Inside the saloon carriage, he received Duma delegates and telegrams from every one of his major front commanders urging him to abdicate. He walked to the window. He looked out at the snow. Then he sat down and signed the abdication of the House of Romanov. He signed it in pencil. He did not abdicate in favor of his hemophiliac son, Alexei. He abdicated in favor of his younger brother, Grand Duke Michael. Michael refused the throne unless a constituent assembly offered it to him. It was not. 304 years of Romanov rule ended in 24 hours at a railway siding in pencil. His diary that night contained one of the most quoted lines of the 20th century. He wrote that he was surrounded by treason, cowardice, and deceit. The provisional government placed him and his family under house arrest at Alexander Palace. Sentries stopped saluting. Official documents called him Citizen Nikolai Romanov. The initial plan was to send the family to Britain. King George V, the Tsar's first cousin, was consulted. The two men looked so alike that visitors had confused them at family weddings. But George, on the advice of his ministers, worried that hosting the Russian imperial family would inflame British public opinion against his own throne. He withdrew the invitation. One cousin reigned for another 19 years in London. The other was sent in August 1917 to Tobolsk in Siberia. By December 1917, the Bolsheviks had seized power. In April 1918, the family was moved to Yekaterinburg, to a house officially called the House of Special Purpose. On the night of the 16th of July, 1918, as anti-Bolshevik forces approached the town, the entire imperial family and their remaining servants were shot in Yekaterinburg. Nicholas was 50. His youngest child was 13. In 1991, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were excavated from a forest pit outside Yekaterinburg. DNA analysis confirmed their identities in 1993. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the family as passion-bearers. The strange surviving trace is a house that no longer exists. The Ipatiev house was demolished on Soviet orders in 1977. In 2003, the Russian government built a cathedral on the site, called the Church on the Blood. It is one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in modern Russia. The state that shot the Tsar built a church for him at the exact place. Nicholas signed away 300 years of Romanov rule in a train carriage in March. Our last entry signed away 2,500 years of Persian kingship on a runway in January. Number 1 is a hospital bed in Cairo. On the first day of January, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was still called Shahanshah, King of Kings. He had been on the throne of Iran since September 1941, when his father had been forced out by the British and the Soviets. He had reigned for 37 years. He had, by his own framing, presided over 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, a claim he had staged at Persepolis in 1971, in one of the most extravagant royal celebrations of the 20th century. In 16 months, he would be dead in a foreign country. The facade in January 1979 was enormous. By 1977, Iran had the fifth strongest military on earth. GDP per capita had climbed from under $100 in the 1940s to more than $2,400 in 1978. Empress Farah Pahlavi had been crowned in 1967 as the first woman in the modern Muslim world to sit as a crowned empress. Underneath it, the country was on fire. Savak, the Shah's secret police, had eliminated liberal and leftist opposition. What was left as a space for dissent was the mosque. The White Revolution had angered the clergy and traditional landowners. In August 1978, a cinema fire in Abadan killed hundreds. In September, the army fired on protesters in Jaleh Square, an event known as Black Friday. By late 1978, the country was in general strike. Oil workers stopped pumping. In January 1979, on the island of Guadeloupe, the leaders of the United States, Britain, France, and Germany met privately. The verdict was that the Iranian monarchy could not be saved. Word reached Tehran. The army began to hesitate. On the 16th of January, 1979, the Shah and Empress Farah drove to Mehrabad Airport. He took the controls of a Boeing 707 himself for part of the flight. He landed in Aswan as the guest of President Anwar Sadat. He told the world he was going on a temporary vacation. He never returned to Iran. From Aswan, he flew to Marrakech, then to the Bahamas, then to Cuernavaca in Mexico. On the 22nd of October, 1979, the United States finally allowed him to enter New York for cancer treatment. 2 weeks later, Iranian students seized the United States Embassy in Tehran. They demanded the Shah's return in exchange for 52 American hostages. The hostages were held for 444 days. The Americans, embarrassed, asked the Shah to leave. He flew to Panama, then back to Cairo at Sadat's invitation. On the 27th of July, 1980, at the Mahdi Military Hospital in Cairo, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died of complications from lymphoma. He was 60. Sadat gave him a state funeral. He was buried at the Al-Rifai Mosque in Cairo, in the same building where his father, Reza Shah, had been buried in temporary exile in 1944. 2 Pahlavi Shahs, 1 Egyptian mosque. Neither of them died in Iran. 15 months later, on the 6th of October, 1981, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by soldiers during a military parade. One of the reasons his killers later gave was his hospitality to the Shah. The strange surviving trace is a ruin in the desert. The tent city built at Persepolis in 1971 for the 2,500-year celebration was never fully dismantled. The concrete pads and rusted frames are still there in the plain below the ancient Achaemenid capital. The regime that overthrew the Shah has left them where they stood. The Iranian wind blows through them. Iran's newspapers, the day the Shah died, called him the vampire of the century. His son, Reza Pahlavi, still lives in Washington, still uses the title Crown Prince of Iran. His father's country has not had a crown for 47 years. 10 thrones, 10 single years. 10 men who woke up one January still called Your Majesty, and, by the following January, needed a passport. A Zanzibari sultan in a Portsmouth suburb, an Egyptian king in a Roman restaurant, a Portuguese king in a West London library, a German Kaiser in a Dutch forest, a Habsburg emperor in a rented Madeira house, a Bulgarian child tsar on an exile train, an Ottoman sultan on a British warship in the rain, an Iranian Shah on a British ship to Mauritius, a Russian tsar in a train carriage in Pskov, a last Shah of Iran in a Cairo hospital bed. The map does not remember them the way they were painted. It only remembers the year they left.